push forward with the Roman centre, shoulder to shoulder, shields locked on the 2nd of August, 216 BC. You are winning. That is what it feels like, packed this tightly into a mass of your own countrymen, watching the enemy line in front of you give ground step by step. The Carthaginian centre is bending backward, retreating under your advance, and every soldier around you reads that the way any soldier would, as victory taking shape. What none of you can see from inside a crowd this dense is what that retreat is actually doing to the shape of the battlefield around you, or how much of it has already closed in on both sides while your attention stayed fixed on the ground you were gaining directly ahead. What does it take to lose 60,000 men in a single afternoon and still refuse to surrender the war? If you want the real story of the worst single day in Roman military history, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. By the summer of 216 BC, Rome has already suffered 2 serious defeats to the Carthaginian general Hannibal, whose campaign into Italy began with one of the most audacious logistical achievements of the ancient world, marching an army, including war elephants, across the Alps into Italian territory Rome had never expected an enemy to threaten directly. At the Trebia River in late 218 BC and at Lake Trasimene the following year, Hannibal inflicted 2 serious defeats on Roman forces, each one demonstrating the same underlying pattern: a Carthaginian commander willing to use terrain, deception and patience against Roman armies that kept trusting their own numbers and discipline to carry the day regardless. By the time Cannae arrives, Hannibal has already proven, twice, that he is not fighting the kind of war Rome's military culture was built to win. The Roman response to those losses is, in its own way, a story about political psychology as much as military strategy. Rather than retreat into caution, Rome answers catastrophe with scale. The Senate authorizes the largest army the Republic has ever fielded, placed under the joint command of 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paullus and Gaius Terentius Varro, following the standard Roman practice of alternating overall command between them on a daily basis when their forces operate together. That command structure has become, over the centuries since, the centerpiece of a popular explanation for what goes wrong at Cannae, a story inherited largely from the historian Polybius, casting Paullus as the cautious, experienced aristocrat and Varro as a reckless, low-born demagogue whose turn at command on the day of the battle supposedly invites disaster. It is a tidy narrative. It is also worth treating with real suspicion, because Polybius's own patron happened to be a direct descendant of Paullus, giving the historian an obvious personal incentive to flatter one commander and cast blame on the other. Modern historians studying the sources note that Varro's supposedly humble origins appear considerably exaggerated in the ancient accounts, and that Varro continued receiving significant Roman commands and commissions in the years after Cannae, an odd reward for a man popular history remembers as reckless and incompetent. The truth is almost certainly more complicated than the simple morality tale of one wise commander undone by one foolish one. One further factor deserves mention, if only because its reliability is itself contested. The Roman historian Livy describes Hannibal deliberately positioning his camp and battle line so that a hot local wind, known as the Volturnus, blew directly into the faces of the advancing Roman troops, carrying dust and grit from the parched summer plain into their eyes and lungs, while leaving his own men fighting comfortably with the wind at their backs. It is a vivid detail, and it may well be true. Hannibal's tactical instincts throughout this campaign show a consistent willingness to exploit every available advantage, environmental or otherwise. But some historians studying the ancient accounts have raised a reasonable doubt worth stating plainly. A battlefield excuse this convenient, blaming a defeat partly on weather rather than purely on tactics or leadership, is exactly the kind of detail pro-Roman chroniclers might have found useful to include after the fact. Whether the wind genuinely played a role or was added later to soften the scale of a purely tactical defeat, no source can settle definitively. Whatever combination of decisions actually led Roman forces onto this field, the numbers alone tell you how confident Rome was walking into it. Hannibal's army numbers somewhere around 25,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Rome's combined force numbers roughly 68,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, an army built specifically on the assumption that overwhelming mass would finally settle what 2 previous defeats had failed to resolve. Hannibal, however, is not planning to fight the battle Rome's numbers are built to win. He arranges his infantry in a formation that bulges outward toward the Roman line at its center, a shape that, to the massed Roman infantry advancing into it, looks exactly like weakness ready to be broken. The troops holding that vulnerable-looking center are largely Gallic and Spanish infantry, lightly equipped compared to Rome's legionaries, exactly the kind of force a Roman commander would expect to buckle under sustained pressure. His most experienced, heavily armored African infantry, veterans of years of campaigning, along with the bulk of his cavalry, he positions instead on the flanks, deliberately out of the initial collision, waiting for a moment the Romans pressing forward have no way to anticipate. If the idea that a battle's true shape can be completely invisible to the men actually fighting inside it interests you as much as it interests us, our members get more of exactly this kind of tactical deep dive, first and uncut. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. Now come back to the center of that Roman advance, to the moment the ground beneath the entire battle actually shifts. You feel the pressure change before you understand why. The retreat you have been pushing into for what feels like the whole engagement has stopped being a retreat at all. The Carthaginian center, which bent so obligingly backward, was never breaking. It was luring the entire mass of the Roman army deeper into a pocket, and now, on both of your flanks, simultaneously, Hannibal's cavalry and his elite African infantry that spent the opening of the battle standing apparently idle, come crashing inward. The sound reaches you before the understanding does, screaming and steel from directions that should be friendly ground, closing distance that was moments ago entirely open. You are packed too tightly to raise a weapon properly in half the directions you would now need to. That is the exact design of what is happening to you. A Roman army built for overwhelming mass has just discovered that mass, in the wrong formation against the right trap, becomes a liability rather than a strength. 68,000 men with less room to fight effectively than a fraction of that number would have had, because there is nowhere left to retreat into that isn't more of the same encirclement. By the time the fighting ends, ancient sources place Roman losses somewhere in the range of 50 to 70,000 killed, against Carthaginian losses commonly cited around 5 to 8,000. Precision beyond catastrophic is not something ancient casualty accounting can reliably offer, but even the most conservative reading of these figures describes one of the deadliest single days of organized warfare in the ancient world, inflicted on an army that outnumbered its attacker by more than 2 to 1. To put that scale in perspective, historians studying the battle have noted that the death toll at Cannae, concentrated into a single afternoon of close quarters fighting with blades and spears rather than the extended timelines and industrial weaponry of later conflicts, represents a rate of killing that few battles in any era have matched. This was not attrition warfare grinding down two sides over days or weeks. It was tens of thousands of men killed in the space of a few hours, in a space small enough that panic and encirclement did as much damage as any single weapon. Men trampled, crushed and cut down in a press too dense in places for the dead to even fall to the ground. What Hannibal did that afternoon, the double envelopment, a numerically inferior force deliberately weakening its own center to draw an enemy into a trap that closes from both flanks simultaneously, remains studied in military academies today as one of the purest tactical executions of encirclement warfare in recorded history. The scale of the loss among Rome's own leadership is captured in one of the more striking details to survive from the battle's aftermath. Under Roman law, gold rings were a privilege reserved specifically for men of senatorial and equestrian rank, a visible marker of status worn only by Rome's political and military elite. After the battle, Hannibal's men gathered the rings stripped from the Roman dead, and the historian Livy records that the resulting collection filled roughly 3.5 modii, a Roman dry measure container, somewhere in the range of 30 litres of gold rings, each one representing a member of Rome's ruling class who had died on this field. Hannibal sent a portion of them, reportedly around 200 rings, back to Carthage with his brother Mago, who poured them out before the Carthaginian Senate as physical proof of the scale of the victory, and used the moment to press for reinforcements while Rome appeared closer to total collapse than at any other point in its history. The senators, by most accounts, cheered at the sight. One did not. Hanno, a longtime political rival of Hannibal's own family, reportedly sat unsmiling through the celebration, arguing that a general who had to beg for money, supplies and reinforcements even after a victory this total was not, in fact, describing a war anywhere near one. Despite Hanno's skepticism, the Senate voted to send support, but when word arrived that Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal had simultaneously suffered a serious defeat in Spain, Carthage redirected the bulk of that promised reinforcement there instead, leaving Hannibal, in the aftermath of the single greatest tactical victory of his career, with little more than a token force of a few thousand Numidian troops and a handful of elephants. Whatever Hannibal might have accomplished by pressing his advantage after Cannae, he was never actually given the resources from home to fully attempt it, a far less dramatic explanation than a single missed decision at a bridge or a battlefield, and on the evidence, a considerably more accurate one. What happened immediately after the battle is where popular history tends to reach for its most famous and least reliable detail. According to a story repeated across centuries of retelling, Hannibal's cavalry commander, Maharbal, urges him to march immediately on Rome itself, reportedly declaring that within 5 days, Hannibal could be feasting in the capital, the traditional site of a victorious Roman general's own triumphal celebration. Hannibal, in this account, refuses, and Maharbal delivers the famous rebuke, that Hannibal knows how to win a victory but not how to use one. It is a genuinely dramatic exchange, repeated in histories and classrooms for 2,000 years as proof of Hannibal's fatal hesitation. It is also very likely fiction. The specific detail about banqueting in the capital reflects a distinctly Roman cultural custom regarding victorious generals, not something a Numidian cavalry commander would have particular reason to reference in exactly that phrasing. Historians studying the passage generally regard it as a later dramatic invention, almost certainly Roman in origin, designed to explain away an uncomfortable question after the fact: why didn't the greatest tactical victory in the war end the war outright? The real answer is less cinematic and considerably more practical. Hannibal's own army was exhausted after the battle, having just executed one of the most demanding coordinated maneuvers in ancient warfare. Rome itself sat roughly 230 miles away, a journey of about 2 weeks by forced march for a force that had not rested. And critically, Hannibal possessed no siege equipment capable of actually breaching Rome's walls even if he reached them. A march on the capital, without the means to take it once he arrived, risked trading his one great tactical advantage for a siege he had no tools to win. Rome's response to the disaster tells you as much about the war's eventual outcome as the battle itself. The Senate refused to negotiate. It refused to pay ransom for Roman soldiers captured and held by Hannibal, a decision that left thousands of Roman citizens in captivity indefinitely, rather than concede any ground toward peace or hand Hannibal the propaganda value of a Roman government publicly buying back its own soldiers. Public mourning itself was formally limited to 30 days, a deliberate policy decision meant to prevent the scale of the loss from paralyzing the state's ability to keep functioning and keep fighting. And despite Cannae being exactly the kind of catastrophic defeat Hannibal had hoped would fracture Rome's alliance network across Italy, the overwhelming majority of Rome's Italian allies remained loyal rather than defecting to the apparently winning side, a strategic failure for Hannibal nearly as significant, in the long run, as his tactical triumph on the battlefield itself had been total. Rome, rather than seeking another decisive battle, shifted its broader strategy in the years that followed, avoiding direct confrontation with Hannibal in Italy while striking at Carthaginian territory elsewhere, a strategic patience that would, years later, carry the war to an entirely different battlefield and a very different outcome, a story for another video. It is worth pausing on just how unusual that choice actually was, by the standards of the ancient Mediterranean world. Most states facing a defeat of this magnitude, an army effectively annihilated in a single day, a war already 2 years old and going badly, would have opened negotiations, or seen a change of government, or simply collapsed under the political weight of the disaster. Rome did none of these things. Its constitutional system, built to survive exactly this kind of shock through distributed authority rather than dependence on any single leader, kept functioning. New legions were raised. New commanders were appointed. The war continued, grinding on for over a decade after Cannae until it ended not on Italian soil at all, but on a different continent entirely, against a Carthaginian general who had never lost a major battle in Italy and would finally lose the one that mattered most, far from home. So think back to that crowded center, to the pressure that changed direction on both sides at once, before anyone standing inside it could fully understand what was happening to them. You were never simply losing a battle that afternoon. You were living inside proof that the largest army you can build is not always the safest one to bring to a fight, that a numerically superior force can be turned, by the right trap and the right discipline on the other side, into the very thing that dooms it, packed too tightly into its own advantage to defend itself once that advantage stopped being one. Rome lost more men in a single afternoon at Cannae than in almost any other defeat in its entire history, and the popular story of what came next. A bold Carthaginian commander urged to finish the war and inexplicably refusing, turns out to rest largely on a speech no one can actually verify was spoken. What actually followed was quieter and, in its way, more remarkable. A state that had just suffered the worst military catastrophe of its existence, refusing every reasonable argument for surrender, absorbing a defeat that would have ended most ancient wars outright, and simply continuing to fight. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the myths separated from the evidence, the defeats given the same honest weight as the victories, the moments where refusing to quit mattered more than any single battlefield outcome, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us further into the shadows.